back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We're calm, we're relaxed, we're quarantined. Luke Jones is quarantined up with his brother. He had wrestling matches over the weekend because we know how essential that is. And Luke, we've been through this. The NFL deems the draft as essential business here this week, and they're going to do this. It's going to be a little weird. It's going to be a little sort of fragmented, I think, on television for sure. There are going to be some hiccups in all of this, and Goodell's not going to get thrown into the Bellagio pool. Maybe they'll run a drone around an empty Vegas or something, but we talked a lot about the Ravens and their needs, and to be honest with you, I have not been an avid NFL Network watcher in the last 10 weeks. I've been onward and upward. We're going to have Coach Billick here this week. We're going to have Greg Cosell and Mike Tanier and a bunch of friends. Dennis, who's a draftnik, is going to come on. He'll be here Thursday before the draft as well. Coons Ford will be bringing you all of the draft picks on our WNST text service. But the rest of the league's picking too, and there's essentially, and we pointed this out, it's hard to get better when you were 14-2. It's hard to say, well, how are they going to be 15-1 this year? The Ravens really are, along with the Kansas City Chiefs and a few others, the hunted this week. There are so many other places where they don't have an Eric DeCosta and a John Harbaugh and a Lamar Jackson. And, their biggest problem is, how are we going to replace Marshall Yanda? There were a lot of teams that already had problems, and they were plagued by them this year. There's 138 miles to the south, right? All of the mayhem of the draft breaks out on Thursday night, and this is a weird year for me because you and I didn't go to the Combine, and we haven't sat around talking to some guy from Louisville or Colorado or USC. I mean, this is going to be a fresh sort of look at the draft for me for the first time really in a quarter of a century.
Sure, and I mean, it's always good to be a team like the Ravens where you are coming off a 14-2 season and you have some needs but aren't necessarily those franchise-altering, fortune-altering kind of decisions. But then you look at the teams in the league who do need a quarterback, and that's what it comes down to. I mean, we can talk about all the other different positions, and certainly there are other needs that every single team has. But if you're one of those teams that is in search of a quarterback, nothing else really matters until you get that right. I mean, that's just the truth. Look how
well, especially when you get it cheap too, right? First contract, Mahomes winning a Super Bowl, Lamar 14. That's where you really get your value because you still can pay Marshall Yanda, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's why you rarely see quarterbacks actually hit the market once they are kind of established as that franchise guy. It's rare, even Tom Brady hitting the market was incredibly rare and how that played out. But
by the way, he's in Tampa. I don't know if you heard.
Yeah, I've heard. Well,
we're going to learn all that, right? That's fun. One of the fun parts of the draft is who signed him, where, who, what, right?
Sure, no question about it. But I think, as is the case with any draft, and I think when you look at the overall layout of this draft, while everyone has talked about the depth, I think as you read more and more from some of the most respected pundits out there, more and more scuttlebutt from executives around the league, it seems as though the true, completely distinguished first-round talent in this draft goes about 20 or 25 deep, and then the thought is from about 25 to, 40, 45, 50, they say there's not a whole lot of separation. But what can always change that? And we talk about this same theme every year. How are the quarterbacks perceived? I think we all understand Burrow's going number one. Barring something
to
very
Cincinnati,
strange,
whether he wants to or not.
Yeah, that's been the expectations for a long time. And when you look at what he did at LSU last year, and people that evaluate quarterbacks coming out of college talk about this guy just having a completely historic, incomparable kind of season. So if we assume that, we understand that, then the question becomes, okay, who's next? I mean, Tua, despite questions about his health, is it Miami? Is it the Chargers? Is it a team moving up, one of those two teams moving up to make sure they get him? So you have that, and then you kind of have the next tier guys, the Justin Herberts, The Jordan Love. I mean,
well, I've heard all those arguments. Right, the one time I did put TV on, McShay and Kuiper yelling about the quarterbacks, right, and the kid from Alabama with the injury that is the wild card in this thing. That's the thing that's going to happen in the first hour of this draft. It's going to move things around, right?
Yeah, and I'm still having a tough time, even with some of the injury concerns that are fair. I mean, this is a guy who had, maybe not to the degree that Dennis Pitta had it, but he had a hip dislocation. I mean, that's a big deal, especially understanding the re-injury potential and what happened with Dennis Pitta in that regard. Now, he didn't have from what I understand, did not have the break, but there's still the question. He had ankle issues at Alabama. So anyone who watched Tua play for the Crimson Tide, you don't deny his talent. You don't deny the ability, but who's going to view him as the right fit? I don't see him sliding down the board all that terribly long just because of the position, the nature of the position. Someone will come up, even if he moves a couple spots. But who's it going to be? I mean, is it going to be Miami, as people thought for a really long time? The Chargers, with Phillip Rivers no longer being there, could make a lot of sense. But then I think you even look at someone like Carolina. As much as they have Teddy Bridgewater, and you're interested to see how that plays out. If they really covet Tua, could it be them? I think later in the draft, of course, but New England's fascinating to see whether they're going to make a play for a quarterback, or is Bill Belichick going to try to prove once again that he's smarter than everyone else and try to win with Jarrett Stidham. I mean, it's just, there are a lot of parts to this. And then I think it's always interesting, especially with what happened with Arizona last year, how they move on from Josh Rosen, they get Kyler Murray. With them being willing to do that last year and basically say, look, it's a new coaching regime, old group pick this quarterback. We're not a big believer in him. We're going to get our guy. That's where then I'd even watch, not that I'd predict it, but I think it's interesting to watch some of those teams at the very top, like even Washington. I mean, are they truly all in on Haskins? Or is Ron Rivera going to say, we're not so sure about this guy? And then do they surprise everyone and take Tua? Probably not, but I think when you do have a new coaching staff or a new GM come in, even if a quarterback was taken the year before, and we know typically when teams are in a position where they have to draft a quarterback, we know that coaches can get fired and GMs can get fired, and it can happen very quickly. But you sometimes wonder, because Arizona was able to do it, and it, by all accounts, looks like it's going to work out really well for them based on how they're positioned and based on how Murray played as a rookie. Is there another team that's willing to reset in that regard? And that's where you do look at Washington, or probably not the Giants, but Daniel Jones. It's not as though I'm convinced he's going to be even Eli Manning moving forward.
Well, every year we have one of those. Every year we have one of these Daniel Jones types or these Josh Rosen types, and we say, that's going to change what about that franchise? And you look up at the top of the draft, and it's sort of the usual suspects, right? I mean, literally, right? I mean, the Detroit Lions, right? The Miami Dolphins, the Washington Redskins. I mean, even the Bengals. With and without Marvin Lewis, I have a feeling this is not the last time they're going to be drafting in the top 5 in the next 5 years, right?
Well, it all depends on Joe Burrow. I mean, we saw with Cincinnati, I mean, it took them some time, but Andy Dalton took them to the playoffs 5 years in a row. Now, he wasn't the only reason why they did it, but it does speak to how a quarterback can change things for you. I mean, the Bengals, they were able to do that. They had some success with Carson Palmer on a couple teams that were pretty good. So, but the history of the Cincinnati Bengals or other teams you see consistently in the top 5 or top 10, it makes you more skeptical if they're going to put the proper players around them. But if Joe Burrow is truly what talent evaluators think he can be, and if he can do what he did at LSU last year, even though it was kind of a one-year wonder out of nowhere kind of scenario, if he is that player at the next level, then that changes everything for the Bengals potentially. I mean, it really does. So it's always interesting. That's why the quarterback position is just so important. That's why teams that move up and trade multiple first-round picks or multiple picks over the course of a 2 or 3 year period, if you hit on the guy, you don't care because that's how important that guy is. That's how important that player is to turning around your franchise. So I just think there are so many teams from the no-brainer category all the way to, that'd be an interesting kind of surprise pick. And I think there's upwards of, you probably have 10 teams you could talk about in that category. Even Tampa Bay, for all the talk about getting Tom Brady and money they guaranteed to him over the next couple years, Tom Brady's going to be 43 years old. There's a very sound argument for them to take a quarterback. So I just think there are a lot of really interesting teams. I mean, the no-brainers, Cincinnati and Miami, that's clear. I think the Chargers are a no-brainer when you're talking about Tyrod Taylor being their current guy, even though I'm not convinced he's going to be that guy come September. But then
it is hard to figure out who the current guys are, right? When Tom Brady's in Tampa and Phillip Rivers isn't in San Diego, and who's where and why, and who's safe and who isn't, and
Cam Newton's a free agent right now, and Andy Dalton's still on the trade market, and Joe Flacco's on the free agent market. I mean, yeah.
Where's Jameis Winston?
Jameis Winston, right? I mean, yeah, you have a lot of names out there that could. Long-term answer, no.
But by the way, there's also a lot of Kirk Cousins and Mitch Trubisky's and guys that are, Matt Ryans that you look at and say, all right, are they really going to win? There's a lot of places where you say, are they really going to win? No one's asking that about Lamar Jackson on Thursday night for some reason, and that's cool because they saw him play last year, but, we're not in that category anymore. It makes it a different kind of draft in 7 or 8 places, but the other 20 places, fans are wondering whether this quarterback's their guy. I mean, even Jets fans are saying, is Sam Darnold our guy? Are we really going to win with that guy or not? There's only a handful of guys where you feel like you have an is and not a might be, right?
And that's why what we're talking about is of the utmost importance for those teams. I mean, whether you have a top 5 pick or whether you're trying to figure out a way to move into the top 5 or the top 10 or make a trade or perhaps you love one of those second-tier type, Jake Fromm kind of guy that isn't going to go in the top 5, but you really think could be, either someone that's polished and better than people give him credit for at the next level, or someone that's going to be a diamond in the rough. Maybe someone that isn't viewed in that same way that we're talking about a Joe Burrow or a Tua, but is going to be that out of nowhere kind of guy, that Dak Prescott kind of guy, that Russell Wilson kind of guy. So, for those teams that lack that answer, what else really matters? The days of really consistently feeling that like you can win without having that kind of impactful player at the quarterback position. And I know some people will talk about Jimmy Garoppolo, but Jimmy Garoppolo wasn't terrible last year. And at the same time, we'll see how San Francisco fares with the fact that they're trying to keep that defense together. That's a challenge, and we've already seen them have to move on from some of those guys. So, as far as from a long view kind of standpoint of being a contender, you need that quarterback. So that's why it dominates the headlines. That's why free agency was completely. The talk was completely dominated by Tom Brady because you're talking about the greatest of all time in that category at least. From that standpoint, that's where you do look at all these teams going into Thursday, going into say early part of day 2 and the very early part of day 3 if there's someone that thinks that they have a diamond in the rough. And then I think what's going to be interesting about this draft is how the quarterback chips fall. What does that mean for Cam Newton? What does that mean for an Andy Dalton type? What does that mean even for a Joe Flacco, who I'm guessing at this point is going to have to accept a backup job, but maybe it's a situation where he can go in and compete with an incumbent that's on very shaky footing. So, I think that's where the quarterback chips, that's why we talk about them so much. And to your point, it is quite nice when you're a team like the Ravens, like Kansas City, like Houston, even though the Texans have all kinds of issues.
Yeah, I was going to say the Texans, maybe they'll deal off Deshaun Watson. They got rid of everybody else, right?
Maybe. I mean, if they dealt Hopkins for what they ended up getting for him, who knows? Bill O'Brien clearly thinks he's smarter than everyone else, even though in the realm of NFL GMs, I'm not sure if he's the total opposite of how he might view himself. But I think it's interesting to see how this is going to play out, and I think there are just so many possibilities, and I think there's some teams that, whether they lack first-round capital or whether they're late in the first round, I would not be surprised to see a team or two make a move where you're talking about trading future picks to try to move up and get a quarterback. So it's going to be a lot of fun in that regard.
Luke Jones is here. He is Baltimore Luke. And, of course, the draft is Thursday and Friday and Saturday, which means that we have lots of places where you can load up on curbside. You can go get some pizza at Pizza John's. You can find our friends at Royal Farms. They're open. They have all the essentials you need. 16-piece chicken family feast, 2 large sides, and a free 2-liter Pepsi product. And we know, like a family feast in Luke's place, just him and his brothers, so 16 pieces will hold on all week. Get on over to Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. Shout out to all of our sponsors, kind of holding it together. Planet Fitness at 7 o'clock every night, doing an online workout. I hope everybody's checking that out. Dennis will be here a couple of times this week. We're going to be doing a lot of NFL draft leading up to the draft, and then after that, we've been doing tons of Baltimore positive stuff as well. You can find all of that. Cal Ripken checked in. That's out in the buy at Toyota.com Audio Vault. Don Moeller and I this week speaking to lots and lots of hospital heads. We're going to have Brad Chambers, Neil Meltzer, some friends of mine on locally to talk about COVID, hospitals, the pandemic, but we're going to try to focus on the draft and stay with our WNST sports roots here, at least for the next week or week and a half. Look, one of the weird things about the Vegas thing, and first off, full disclosure, I was supposed to wake up this morning in San Francisco with Julio. We're supposed to do the wine country today. I was thinking about extending the trip another day and a half and just going to Vegas on Wednesday and doing the Vegas draft thing because I figured I was on the West Coast anyway and it was work-related and I would check it out and I would see some NFL people and who knows whatever trouble I get into in Vegas. And the weirdest part about this is, like, right now I have Peter King's mock draft up. And Peter and I were supposed to do radio like literally the day that the pandemic broke out a month ago. I haven't bugged him. He hadn't bugged me. I'll bug him next week. So we'll have Peter King on after the draft. But I looked down and pick number 12, Las Vegas. Yeah,
Weird.
Yeah, it's like seeing Los Angeles Chargers or Los Angeles Rams again or any of the other weird things that we've seen. New Orleans Pelicans is still weird to me. But the Las Vegas Raiders, there's so many things about this draft, including, like, what's Belichick going to do without Tom Brady for the first time in 20 years? There's just a lot of little things when teams go on the clock that you sort of check back in with football again, and you check back in with who's that quarterback, and that's right, Marshall Yanda's not here anymore, and who's coaching them, and who's their coordinator, and what happened to that guy, and Joe Douglas is running the Jets, and you start to move bodies around a little bit. How they're going to do that on television where it's not Kuiper sitting next to Susie, sitting next to Berman, sitting next to, Rich Eisen, sitting next to Billick, by the way, Las Vegas, Mayock runs them now, and Gruden coaches them now. This is the time to kind of check in with all of that for me as a fan.
Yeah, I think that's why, even more so than free agency, because free agency is so fragmented and all over the place. This is, even though
free agency is a Twitter feed kind of sort, right?
It sounds weird saying this because no one's congregating, but it is that congregation of seeing what the league's going to look like. And even from the, bringing it back to the Ravens, as much as we've talked about positions of need and what they've done in free agency and acquiring Calais Campbell, this is when you truly get a really good feel for what your football team's going to look like. And yeah, there'll be some exceptions. Cam Newton will wind up somewhere. Andy Dalton will be traded and be a placeholder. Maybe he winds up as New England's quarterback for a year. Who knows? But for the most part, around the league, draft weekend is when we really get a good idea of what each team's going to look like. And to your point, that's where fans who maybe aren't all in on mock drafts and aren't as engaged with free agency, at least what's going on elsewhere, you do get a better sense of what the rest of the league's looking like. I always point to the draft and the schedule release as far as what really gives you context for the new season. You know, everyone's been talking about the 2020 season from the moment the Ravens walked off the field against the Titans and what was such a disappointing, heartbreaking loss after a 14-2 year. But from that point on, Ravens fans have been looking to 2020. Well, now we'll get a better idea of what the right guard position is going to look like. We'll get a better idea of what weapons Lamar Jackson's going to have in addition to Marquise Brown and Mark Andrews. We'll get a better idea of what inside linebacker and edge rusher looks like. And we do that then for all the other teams. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with Cleveland and what happens with Cincinnati. And Pittsburgh, I mean, the health of Ben Roethlisberger is such a wild card this year. The Ravens are the clear favorite in this division, and they should be after going 14-2. But when you talk about Pittsburgh's defense, if Ben Roethlisberger comes back and is healthy and the elbow is functional and he looks like Ben Roethlisberger, well, you kind of think about how I don't want to say pesky. That's probably not the right word, but the Steelers were still able to be competitive last year. You throw him back in the mix, and maybe they add another weapon to their offense. Okay, that's a more formidable team than they were a year ago. Cleveland has tried to beef up its offensive line. They still have some more work to do for sure, but different coaching staff. No one's denied the talent that was there, even if it didn't manifest on the field in terms of results. And even Cincinnati, as much as you kind of laugh and say, okay, they're number one pick and poor Joe Burrow, if you looked at what they did, especially on the defensive side of the ball, they quietly made some signings that I liked. And not to say that the Bengals are going to go 10-6, but they might not be the absolute joke that they were last year for all season. So, from that standpoint, if you're a Ravens fan, look, I think you can feel pretty good about putting away that that extra money for an AFC North Champions T-shirt again, if you want to. I would feel very confident about that. But what's that path going to look like, and what's the rest of the division going to look like? Is it going to be a little more competitive than it was last year? I think it has the potential to be. And then you kind of look the rest of the AFC. I mean, Kansas City, they're defending champs. Tennessee, you saw what they were at the end of last year. Whether you're a big believer to the point that they gave Ryan Tannehill the money that they did, whether you're a big believer in Derrick Henry doing that again, that you still have to give the Titans their props. So you kind of look around the rest of the conference, and this is when you really start to size things up and say, okay, Ravens, where they stand in this hierarchy. I mean, it's very clear they're right at the top with Kansas City. But where does everyone else fit? And the draft starts to give you that context. And then whenever we do have the schedule release and, getting into the hypotheticals about what the season could look like if we have a season, that's part of it. But you start to get that context, and you start to, you get that light at the end of the tunnel as far as, okay, here's what 2020 is starting to look like. And, the draft is just, I think it's Christmas for football fans who look at it from a roster building standpoint.
Well, especially in the the desert of coronavirus and pandemic, and no baseball and no golf and no tennis and no sports and no NASCAR. And how's the wrestling life going? How essential is wrestling, Luke? Can you let me know about that?
Well, I mean, look, everything with Vince McMahon and being listed as an essential business in Florida and understanding Linda McMahon's
what a scumbag, dude. I mean, one thing, and I've given up on wrestling for 30 years, and I know they're all scumbags. We're talking about Roger Goodell and Bob Kraft here right now, right? And Jerry Jones and Dan Snyder, amongst others. But, man, this has just been a display of corruption and dirt and grime for the McMahon family. It really has been.
Well, you kind of look at what happened over the last 10 days. I mean, the XFL folds. You kind of look at some of the creditors there, and it turned out that many of the shares which Vince McMahon had advertised as not being WWE ended up being owned by WWE. So you have that. You have the essential business label, which, essential, non-essential. There's. I think there's.
Hey, King Liquors is essential, and don't you tell
right.
me otherwise.
There's a much larger debate at work there that goes far beyond the sports world. But with that, and then what happened mid last week with the number of WWE superstars that were laid off, not just wrestlers, but Mike Chioda, who had been a WWE referee since 1989, I believe it was. Some of their producers and some of the people behind the scenes, some of their agents. It was a bloody day in that regard, as far as a lot of layoffs, a lot of furloughs.
Well, they still make money on the gate, right? People showing up and being there is still a primary way they make money, other than the $10 a month you and your brother give them, right? Like the subscription is enormous, but it's not enormous like packing arenas 6 nights a week all over the world, right?
It's not. However, I will say, look at their television contracts with Fox for Friday Night SmackDown and USA for Monday night.
Oh, look, Vince can afford to pay his referee. You know what I mean? It's a different situation than old Ness and Luke, applying for the PPP with Wells Fargo than it is with the WWE.
Correct.
It really is incredible. It's like the scumbag delivering the boxes to the door here, right? That, has billions of dollars and has his employees going around picking up COVID. I'm blown away by all of this, and I talk about this 24 hours a day out in the real world because it's kind of more significant than who the Ravens are going to pick at 28 on Thursday night, and I've come to that conclusion at 52. It took me a long time, Luke, to think that this stuff was more important, but it's been fascinating. McMahon being in the middle of this and being on some board about reopening America to sports is, I would say, I would laugh if I couldn't cry, but I watch this drug addict get up in front of the country every night at 6 o'clock and behave like a WWE character. It's very obvious he steals a lot of his tone from what he's watched on Channel 45.
Yeah, but I think it's unfortunate as far as some of the talent that was looked at. And part of this, as you know, Nestor, professional wrestling is very different than it was 35 or 40 years ago when we were still on the back end of the territory system.
Back when Howard Finkel got involved, right?
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned Howard Finkel because I want to mention him in a moment. But WWE in recent years, they've been able to hoard talent. They just have. They've given talent these contracts, and many of them not used, many of them unhappy, wanting to be released to go to AEW, the new upstart that's involved with TNT and the Khan family. Many wanting to go to New Japan or Ring of Honor locally. There are so many that just want to perform and want to wrestle, and so many that were denied releases. And then, this happens, and they're let go at a time when they can't easily pick up work elsewhere. So it's just really unfortunate in that regard, and a lot of really good people within the industry lost their job. And you mentioned it, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Howard Finkel passing away late last week. I'd heard the Fink, his health had not been good in recent years. It's been a while since he's been involved day to day with WWE, and but you talk about here in Baltimore, we think of Chuck Thompson, and you think of John Miller more recently, and different names that Johnny Holiday down in College Park. The Fink was a voice of my childhood as a professional wrestling announcer. The voice of when WWF would run shows at MSG and Philly and all. You think about how the system used to be. You heard Howard Finkel doing the ring announcements. You knew it was a big deal.
I had never seen him do anything until he showed up on USA Network, right? We had our ring announcer here in Baltimore. Sure. There was Gary Michael Capetta and Joe McHugh back in the day, and Finkel was on at the Garden, and then he just never went away, literally.
And he was literally Vince McMahon. He was the first employee when things kind of started to shift, and it kind of got away from how things were way back when with the WWF, and New York being when things started to ramp up, and that was a gradual process, and then of course exploded in the mid '80s. But Howard Finkel was famously WWF's first employee, and also kind of speaks to the whole independent contractor and lack of union and everything with wrestlers, which continues to be an issue even today. But I'll definitely miss the Fink, and for me, I kind of think about him. I think about my era of Orioles baseball growing up in the '90s. John Miller, Chuck Thompson, of course, for previous generations. But from a pro wrestling standpoint, you heard the Fink, you knew it was a big match coming up. So definitely bittersweet to hear that news. Although, like I said, it had not been a big secret within the wrestling world that his health had been failing the last couple of years.
All right, a little wrestling, little football, little draft. Anything you want to say about baseball, the Orioles? Anything? No? You done?
Oh,
you good?
I mean, I'll echo to you when we talked about this last week. Things continue to look really good in South Korea, and the KBO is looking to open its season at the beginning of May.
Where's Adam Jones in all this? I don't follow him. I think he may have blocked me on Twitter.
He's in Japan.
Is he playing? They're not playing, are they?
They are still, from what I understand, still in a holding pattern. I think they've had some players.
Well, I bet he's eating really well.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt. I mean, I see him on Instagram. I mean, it seems like he and his family are doing well. But I mean, what a weird situation for someone like him who goes to Japan. One of the byproducts of that was going to be an idea that he was probably going to play in the Olympics for the United States because the Japanese league was going to shut down for the 2 weeks for the Olympics, and there was talk about that, and obviously that's postponed, and who knows what's going to happen with that in 2021. So definitely strange, but on the positive side from a baseball standpoint, South Korea, Taiwan, it seems as though they're going to at least be able to start a season and see how it plays out. And if it's being done somewhere else, that's where, as a sports fan, understanding it's very cautious, but that's where you have some optimism that perhaps we see some baseball at some point later, at some point months from now, however it looks. Again, no guarantee, but if it can happen somewhere else, why can't it happen here at some point in the coming months? So, from that standpoint, other than that, kind of a holding pattern, and still wishing the best for Trey Mancini. And
we had Cal Ripken on this week talking about cheating. I asked Cal, I said, "Did you cheat?" He said, "I never cheated." I'm like, "All right, good." And Moeller actually texted me after. He said, "Man, you asked Cal if he cheated." I'm like, "Yeah, we have to, right? Don't you?
Although I've also seen him make some comments that he didn't crucify the Astros in the same way that a lot of people did. I think. Again, it kind of goes
talked at length about that. That's So yeah.
I mean, not that. I mean, he's talked about it how he didn't like getting signs himself, but it kind of goes back to that old. There's gamesmanship. There's blatant cheating. There's that line, and how the Astros completely kind of wiped that line away very clearly. So,
have you heard him tell the hidden ball story?
The hidden ball story? No, I haven't.
Well, then you have to go listen then. Okay,
I'll have to go check it out.
Cal told the story about a hidden ball trick. I'll promote it in that way and just say you should go hear it. I'm sure it's a story maybe he tells in his, when he sits on a stage and we did 45 minutes with Cal and and a lot of it was sort of storytelling to a situation in the same way that Brian Billick does. And Brian will be on this week, our partner on behalf of Living Classrooms, of course. You're doing a lot of public speaking. The Cal told a story about the hidden ball trick and sort of the honor of that, so, and how he felt about that. And he told a story I had never heard him tell. So there were a couple stories in this one that I've never heard him tell. So,
and I'll say this, I mean, Cal, and you can speak to this better having covered him during his career, his competitiveness. I mean, wrestling in the clubhouse, making a game out, the legendary basketball games he would have at his old home. I mean, you better believe, even if he wasn't stealing signs and felt a certain way about that, you better believe Cal was looking for any edge he could within reason, as far as within the rules he was going to look for an edge, though.
Hey, man, Brady Anderson was in the same locker room with him. All those guys were. So, like, that was going around, and that never touched Cal, and Cal's never touched it, but it was going around. There was plenty of guys looking for an edge back in the day.
Sure.
And where cheating is and where cheating isn't. We had guys. He had teammates who guys climbed through cages of Jacobs Field to steal bats that were corked. So let's call it what it is. We've called all of that cheating was a part of baseball, but in this particular case, They haven't had a chance to even come get their medicine, right? I mean, that's the weird part of the pandemic is we were all going to have damnation and hell was going to rain down on Jose Altuve.
How about the fact that the report hasn't even come out on the Red Sox as a result of this? But I'll also say, and even going back, and we've talked about this, there are a lot of people who also empowered a lot of that. Let's be clear. The owners very well could have done something about that in the 90s if they really wanted to, but hey, the home run race in '98, and it was profitable, and it was post-strike, and so there's a lot of culpability to go around there. It starts with the individuals, and the Astros at some point, there will be medicine, but there's a lot of tentacles when it comes to a lot of that stuff, and it even speaks to Cal with something as simple as the hidden ball trick. I mean, even the best of guys are still going to look for an edge. It's just a matter of where that line is, and you hope people aren't willing to cross it, but we've seen over the history of the game that more often than not, it's going to be crossed. And the history of cheating in baseball is as long as the history of baseball. And I'm not saying that to make it right. It's just offering the context and the perspective that's existed since the game was invented in the mid-1800s.
All right, Luke, so we're going to play the game now that I used to play back when Billy coached the Ravens, where I walk through the hallways and I get every personnel person to write down who they think the Ravens are going to wind up with. So the Ravens are 28. What's the one player, if you have to mock a player to the Ravens, who you got?
I'll go with Kenneth Murray, inside linebacker from Oklahoma.
A lot of people go with him. Yeah.
Do I feel great about that? No. In fact, as more time goes on and I see how this draft profiles and where the Ravens' needs are and where some of the depth is, I would not at all be surprised if they aren't moving back, whether it's moving back a couple spots or moving out of the first round entirely, and really trying to take advantage of that depth from what's considered to be 25 through 50. Somewhere in that neighborhood.
Trying to get three players in that range.
Yeah. So, I don't feel strongly about, Kenneth Murray. I think, him or Patrick Queen. I mean, Eric DeCosta kind of talked about it in his conference call where he talked about the prospects. I mean, those two are kind of like Coke or Pepsi. I mean, take your pick. Murray certainly had a more experienced career at Oklahoma, played 3 years. Queen was a one-year starter, although LSU, a little bit more stout defensive program than Oklahoma in recent years. I think Queen probably has a higher ceiling, but Kenneth Murray, very productive, and a guy who played downhill, and maybe some fair questions about him in coverage, and maybe Queen profiles. Queen does profile better in that way, but Murray probably a little more. Guy a little more downhill, whereas Queen maybe a little more lateral movement. But that said, as much as I talk about those guys, there are others, Jordan Brooks and Akeem Davis-Gaither and Troy Dye and Willie Gay and Malik Harrison. I mean, those are all guys that could fit somewhere in the second or third round for the Ravens at inside linebacker. So Kenneth Murray's my guy if you're going to ask me to pick someone, but as you know, Nestor, when you're talking 28, it's a lot different than being 10th on the board.
Throwing darts is what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, there is so much that can happen, but I do think, maybe more so than other years. I think there is a potential for the Ravens to move back, but I think where that might not be as easy, or maybe it doesn't happen. One, the environment of this draft, understanding that logistics of making a trade might be a little more complex than usual, given the nature of everyone being spread out, even teams not having war rooms in the way that they traditionally do. And two, if the Ravens recognize where the depth of and the real value in this draft is, a lot of other teams are too. So I think, and you've already seen reports of this, you've already seen speculation of this, of other teams trying to move back as well. So, when it comes down to it, if they make a pick at 28, would not be surprised to see Murray, but I think it could be a number of guys. Another guy to at least keep in mind, Cesar Ruiz, center from Michigan, profiles at center or guard. You figure the Ravens have some good intel with Jim Harbaugh with the Wolverines. So, that if they're looking to address Marshall Yanda, whether directly or indirectly, just trying to beef up that interior offensive line, Ruiz, I could see him making some sense at 28 as well.
Luke Jones can be found. Baltimore Luke. You can follow him out on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all of those places that we do football coverage. You're going to be doing some football coverage this week. We're going to hear from Coach Billick. We're going to hear from Mike Tanier. Dennis Kalatzos is going to join us throughout the week. He loves the draft. He'll be here on Thursday bringing draft coverage to you. Luke and I will be a part of that on Thursday as well. And the aftermath, and of course, you'll be getting all the picks and the brought to you, of course, by our friends at Kuntz Ford Security Boulevard on the WNST Tech Service. So make sure you're checking that out. Get some Rofo, bring some chicken home, order some crab cakes online, have them shipped wherever you are. You can have Fadley's crab cakes while you're sitting there and watching the draft. You can have Pizza John's Pizza. Curbside, take care of our sponsors, take care of each other. Wash your hands. Keep calm. Stay local. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and Baltimore Positive, and we never stop talking stuff and draft and safety and all that good stuff.